Okay, we are live. Well, in this video, this is supposed to be kind of a low-key live stream about young Earth creationism. We're going to release a video on that tomorrow, and I just kind of wanted to release a video detailing some of my thoughts that I've, made in a few Facebook posts. They're pretty low-effort Facebook posts. High effort in the sense that people put very little effort into most of their Facebook posts, but low effort in the sense that they are indeed Facebook posts. So, but yeah, no, it's interesting debate in light of what's going on in the Missouri Synod right now, and so as such, always an interesting topic that intersects with science, history, philosophy, and theology. So yeah, with that said, I'm here with my, our good friend Tony, a contributor to the channel, and yeah, someone I've debated with, and we have differing perspectives on this issue, but it's always good to talk.
Yes, it is.
So yeah, I'm gonna read out this long essay here. It's in three parts, so we'll probably, take questions or just discuss amongst ourselves during the gaps. So yeah, with that said, I will begin. In this video, I will defend the viability of young Earth creationism. To start, this is I did a live stream on my own account about this earlier, but since I never use my own account, I just decided to redo it for this. So that's why the script sounds like it's a full video rather than a pretty informal live stream. So in this video, I will defend the viability of young Earth creationism. I take this to be the position that the Earth was prepared over the course of 6 natural or 24-hour days. I will also defend the global character of Noah's flood, which is typically defended alongside the first belief. Of course, one could defend a global flood without a belief in 6 natural creation days. People like Norm Geisler do that. One could also defend a local flood while affirming the naturalness of the creation days. Someone like Matthew Pohl in church history has defended that view. But in order to simplify the matter, I will defend both propositions together. So that leads to section one, where I defend a apparent age model for young Earth creationism, but one that is not a partial apparent age, but in a very real sense, a causally coherent apparent age model. So in this section, I will defend a model of young Earth creationism, YEC for short, that does not rely on creation science, the project of collecting evidence for a young Earth created by God 6 to 10,000 years ago. I will also try to defend a model of the global flood that does not hinge upon the controversial notion of flood geology. The idea that Noah's flood, deemed to be global in extent, has a wide and discernible impact on the geological column. Perhaps there is extensive evidence for both positions and ideas. I'm not a geologist. Nonetheless, given how controversial both notions are in the broader scientific community, I will jettison a commitment to both models of creation research in favor of apparent age and a supernatural account of Noah's flood. So that presses the question, what is apparent age? The doctrine of apparent age states that God sometimes creates things that look as though they went through a long and drawn out process to come to the way we see them today, yet without having gone through that process, Philip Goss, the originator of the omphalos or the navel hypothesis, the belly button hypothesis, asks whether Adam had a belly button or whether the trees in the garden had tree rings. Young Earth creationists generally admit the evidence for the latter is more convincing than the former. That's because Adam's belly button had no discernible function in the context of an apparently aged universe. Trees with long histories might be necessary to produce oxygen for Adam. Similarly, starlight created in transit might serve to evidence the grandeur of God. This is just one evidence that old earthers typically provide for the universe being ancient, is that there are these distant lights emitting from these stars that seem to be created almost on their way, so to speak, and ordinarily that would seem to be, imply billions of light years. So while at first glance this might appear problematic, I find it no more problematic than many of the issues the old earther has in his model. After all, the old earther still has to explain why God created such a large universe that might not appear at first glance to evidence his glory to anyone in particular, save he and the angels. And as an example, I would say, think of like a small Pluto-sized planet on the edge of the universe. Well, like what impact does that have to rational creatures? Presumably very little, but God still has some reason for doing it, and it plays some extrinsic teleological role in ordering the creation in the way that he intends. So with that said, there is a distinction between total and partial apparent age models. For the sake of argument, I will defend the former. That is, I will argue even the fossil record is the result of God creating rocks with the remnants of creatures that may have not even existed. I do not see such a great implausibility here. I do not believe it results in last Thursdayism, the idea God created everything last Thursday with the appearance of age, precisely because God told us what he did. He didn't leave us in the dark to guess, as to whether this is the case or not. We are just told that, these supernatural formative processes were created in the middle of things. Indeed, I also see no reason why the skeptical scenario can't apply to other instances of God's working in the scriptures. It seems like if the premise is that the apparent of age is deceptive, then it's deceptive always. And if there's instances in which it's not deceptive, there's nothing problematic as such about using this as a idea in one's model of creation research. Do the observers of Jesus' miracle at Cana really need to check their senses? Does Adam, seeing his mature body, need to question the truthfulness of God? I see no reason why they ought to. They have a spontaneous principle of credulity, quoting Thomas Reed here. They are inclined to believe that which is before their senses. When God, through the light of faith, tells them there is more to the story, that only enlightens their inference. Perhaps the opponent of total apparent age will claim fossils evidence death in the creation record, and that's incompatible with God's very good creation. Despite the fact that a number of young earthers in church history didn't see a contradiction between animal death in Genesis 1, Aquinas and arguably Augustine, I think pretty inarguably actually, but Augustine, at least in the retractions, has a bit of agnosticism on this question. I myself failed to see the contradiction on the supposition of a no animal death before the fall scenario. All of God's works have a functional element and a non-functional element. The sheer height of a mountain might be functional for Adam, but it being this height rather than that one doesn't matter much. Moreover, perhaps God was anticipating the fall with certain features of creation without thereby willing the actual occurrence of the fall. For instance, God creates oil deposits, and these may have been present before the fall because God knew we would use it after it. Presumably, these would be pretty unuseful in a non-fallen world, and they do evidence at least some types of death, plant death, for instance. But God still wills these because humans can make use of that. They're not ultimately pointless in relation to our endeavors. God's mission in Genesis 1 was to create a world in the middle of things that would anticipate the processes that would take place afterwards. Young earthers are at least comfortable with plant and invertebrate fossils. That is to say, they're comfortable with the idea that there isn't anything unbenign about, plant death and invertebrate death in general. At least Genesis 1 doesn't cover that. So why couldn't God place the fossil of a large sea creature or a T-Rex in the record? Perhaps Adam, living for a long time, would see this as evidence of the extent and the strength of God's creative word to be able to subdue and outlast a creature of such magnitude. It may sound implausible, but to me it sounds no more implausible and ad hoc than the way us Christians explain the relation of microscopic features of creation in remote parts of the galaxy to the ultimate glory of God. The fact that the universe is so big, that it's so specific in its bigness, that there's, it's not just big in a generic sense, but it's big and it has lots of things that we have no hope of probably ever exploring. Well, as someone who does a lot of apologetics and who tackles a lot of the questions of like skeptical theism and why God might have reasons for doing things that are inaccessible to us, I've never found this objection to the Omphalos hypothesis to be that convincing. So, moreover, this is not all too different from the predicament creationists have always been in. Aristotle thought the world was eternal. Christians, meanwhile, typically argued that God was capable of creating in the middle of Aristotle's eternal sequence. I think that's right, and I think God has good reasons to create in the way he did. God is like a novelist who flings his characters into the middle of the story. The story has an interesting backstory, one that the reader can speculate on and study. After all, the backstory has conceptual existence in the author's mind, in this case, God. The things the geologist works with are fossils, markers of things that have exemplars in the divine intellect. The scientist can study these markers ex hypothesis, on the hypothesis that God created them billions of years ago. But he doesn't have to commit himself to their actual existence if other evidence, namely the evidence of Scripture, suggests otherwise. Indeed, I think this conceptual model of creation has much fruit in theology. Ken Colson argues God has a set procedure in mind with what he calls supernatural formative processes, or SFPs for short. SFPs are essentially accelerated natural processes that God uses on the creation days. They're supernatural in the sense that they're sped up. On day 3, God uses supernatural formative processes to bring about the seed-bearing plants in record time. He tells the earth to bring forth vegetation, and that happens if you take Genesis 1 to be 6 natural days in the course of 24 hours. Similarly, he also wills that the earth and the water start separating on day 3. On my model, God is willing a creative strategy where the earth, already containing fossils, starts a process of tectonic movement that would mimic its later movements after the fall. Scientists are right to study these processes. They do indicate the method and strategy God has in mind. But he shouldn't expect God to work in precisely the way the record indicates in terms of later normal speed processes. This is the case in miracles, certainly. It's also the case, seems to be the case in terms of how Adam was created and perhaps the creatures in the garden. I don't think it's problematic to apply this sort of logic to creation as the whole. I would say that, again, it's just God following his own logic that he established in the garden. So God has a conceptual ordering of the creation days in terms of how the days relate to one another. Of course, the plants on day 3 and the light on day 1 would ordinarily rely on the sun for light bearing and sustenance. Indeed, God might work the laws of physics with the sun in mind during these formative processes, sustaining the plants in the Earth's orbit supernaturally to indicate the future existence and the role of the greater light and the lesser light. Why would God do this? Well, firstly, he might will the stars before the earth, or rather the earth before the stars, because humans are special in God's creation. The sheer magnitude of creation wouldn't evidence this, but its first place in God's works of old sure would. Secondly, humans were inclined to worship the sun and the moon and the seasons. God is evidencing the fact he doesn't need them and the fact that they are indeed creations that serve at his will and fiat. This is pretty rough, by the way. It's a Facebook post, and I put very little effort into editing it. Many of God's miracles have a logical ordering. That is, they reflect the normal, natural causes they are supposed to mimic. When God turns water into wine, he may have ordered the water to wine process in terms of the long drawn out operation whereby grapes turn into suitable fruits of the vine. That process is the conceptual context for the miracle. As such, there is a conceptual universe in God's mind and a physical universe in reality. Scientists' job is to think God's thoughts after him, but not necessarily in the way God thought them. So the non-wise seer is right to see creation as evidencing process, but they are wrong to infer this necessarily implies normal speed processes. It could, but if God tells us otherwise, or if we can infer different types of processes from good and necessary consequences from the scriptural evidence, that ought to be sufficient. Obviously, the big question here is if the scriptures clearly teach young earth creationism. If they don't, then I think that, like, again, this might be a plausible account, but you might jettison it for other reasons. Perhaps it sounds implausible to you, but if you do think that the scriptures teach young Earth creationism, then I think something like this is pretty unavoidable. So yeah, with that said, that is the first section. Anything to add, Tony?
No, I think that's a pretty good overview of what I've heard the apparent age position is. Um, I like the fact that I think you're broadening it to try and allow, like, I guess, as much young earthers views into it as possible. Like, you don't have to commit yourself to like all these really strict principles. You can kind of like be, like, you don't have to commit to no animal death before the fall to on this view, right? Like, you don't have to make super duper strong commitments like that. Um, you can kind of be like a little bit more, uh, I guess, open to certain things on this view because you're able to kind of have history fit, or the fossil records and everything allow to fit in this paradigm like quite nicely, I guess. That makes sense.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and I think that's one of the strengths of this is that, yeah, I don't think that you have to drastically reinterpret the evidence. I think that you
right,
can even be open to the evidence looking like it implies evolution, right? And that
right.
is perfectly possible. In fact, us humans might be the sort of thing that, look like we came about through the evolutionary process. That doesn't ultimately mean that Adam was created in like you know, uh, small initial group. Uh, but it does mean that he might look like the sort of thing that came about that. And as I argue later, I think there's an implied context. So, one of our commenters asks, does the Book of Concord teach young Earth creationism? No, it does not.
Mm-hmm.
What about the early Orthodox Lutherans? Yeah, I mean, they tend to accept young Earth creationism. Very few people didn't. Obviously, there's Augustine's view was of interest to them, and they discussed that. But pretty much all of them are young Earth creationists of a pretty naive variety, I guess you can say. That they took a lot of principles for granted. I mean, they tended to be pretty much maximalist about the amount of physical evidence you can get from the scriptures, to the point that I think a lot of people would be pretty uncomfortable with some of the things they believed. Uh,
Mm.
so I don't think, I'd probably defend more something like Calvin's model of understanding, uh, of understanding, physical phenomena in the scriptures, and say that, they're basically describing, the visible form of the world, and not, committing us to the, you know, intrinsic substance of it. Are you guys theistic evolutionists? I mean, no, in the sense
Nah.
that, I mean, my view is that I'm open to the evidence looking like it implies something like evolution, but that, I mean, my own personal belief is that the Earth is, you know, certainly less than, a few 100,000 years old. That's certainly not a young Earth creationist viewpoint. I mean, it could be very, very young. I mean, it's not a theistic evolutionist viewpoint, rather. Uh,
Right, yeah, because what the apparent, like, you use the analogy of almost like a conceptual thing, like if you write a book with a backstory to the characters, like, you're pointing out that there's something that led to where the world is now in the story, but those things don't actually exist necessarily in the confines of your story, but they're like concepts set in place. So these, you could kind of, that's the distinction you made to show like how the evidence shows like something like evolution occurred, but since you have an appearance of age model, um, you're not saying that actually literally occurred in that way, but it's appearing to be that way. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I get into this, in section 3, but I would argue that, around the point conceptually in which these evolved hominids come into the equation, God supernaturally creates Adam and Eve, which are an initial pair. They're not created out of this initial population. They aren't like an initial population in which the soul is infused into these people. And I also believe that there really aren't any other rational hominids except Homo sapiens. I mean, that's my own belief. I think that there is probably interbreeding between you know things like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, but that would be problematic. It's not a good thing that happens
Yeah, and
between those.
that's like sort of like besides like the age of the Earth, or like the interpretation of the days question, right? Like
Yeah,
whether or not humans bred with those kinds of things, that's sort of like its own independent topic, basically.
I
Like
mean,
that wouldn't have anyone's that in of itself doesn't necessarily have anyone's bearings on how one interprets the days in Genesis. Would that be right?
yeah, I mean, theoretically, I mean, you could push Adam pretty far back and say that he's like this, common ancestor of like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, basically like what William Lane Craig says.
Yeah.
But I would still, yeah, even in that scenario, I would affirm that Adam is the first. I mean, he is the first human. Everything comes from him, and there isn't like any sort of you know biological or spiritual antecedent to him. I mean, there would be biological antecedent in the sense that there's an implied context for God creating Adam in the place that he created him. So there might
Mhm.
be other things that look like him, so to speak. But I've never, I mean, even if you are skeptical of evolution, and I'm very skeptical, I mean, I think there's a lot of issues with common descent. I think there's a lot of issues with the mechanisms of natural selection, just explaining all of biological diversity. But even if you aren't like especially skeptical of that, I would still say, I mean, you could just say that there's like some almost great chain of being where there's creatures that look like they're more like Adam, that mimic his spirituality a little more, and then there's creatures that are less. But there is a certain point in which there's humans and non-humans, and the humans are the ones that come from Adam. They're the ones with souls, and the
Right.
creatures without souls are not humans. And presumably, they wouldn't evidence behaviors that mimic humans, except in the sense that, I mean, it just is the case that the higher primates tend to behave more like humans than the lower ones do, right?
Mhm.
And presumably, if Neanderthals or these other entities are closer to humans in terms of their place, I guess you can say, on the great chain of being, they're going to behave more like us. But there is a point in which you get a soul in the equation and like self-reflective rational behavior. And I would argue that, like, to all indications, my view is that Neanderthals lack this. Obviously I'm going on the basis of you know testimony I'm getting from other people, because I haven't been able to do the work on my own here. But if you look at like reasons to believe in some of these other people, I mean, they're pretty skeptical of the idea that Neanderthals exhibited like unambiguous rational behaviors. I mean, they're certainly more proto-rational than like apes are, but it is like a matter of degree and not kind. Like, that's my view. Now,
Sure.
of course, if you think that like Neanderthals were doing all these cave paintings and stuff, then that's an issue, and that might mean that you have to push Adam farther back on this picture, right? And
Right. And that's sort of independent, right? Like you could hold your model regardless of like which view you took, basically. Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, you like the point of this is, I mean, I'm sympathetic with saying that there's like mechanisms that you can introduce, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
like speed this up, right? I mean, you could even theoretically say that like, I don't know, there's mechanisms. I mean, the archaeological evidence wouldn't be explained by this, but let's just say that theoretically you think archaeological evidence for humans only begins like, I don't know, like 6,000 years ago. I mean, theoretically, you could push that back if you think humans aren't related to Neanderthals in like any sense. You could push that like really, really forward and just say that like God introduced these like, sped up like mutational, front loaded like DNA, so to speak, right? And you could say that like that explains like biological diversity, because God gave us like an arbitrary amount of genetic diversity. He wants humans to be fruitful and multiply, and so he introduces, arbitrarily genetically diverse humans onto the scene as his first two human creations. Like that's possible. I'm basically assuming that like that's just not true, just for the sake of argument, and saying
Sure.
here's what happens, right? I'm pretty
Yeah.
skeptical of that, as I said, but like that's, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's besides the point, I think. But yeah,
Right. Yeah. I think like your model allows for people to have like open debate and open discussion on issues like that. Right. Like
right.
you could come to different sides on a lot of those issues and still hold to your model. So I think that's like an appealing thing to it at first glance. Um,
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, if you think the flood explains a lot of the evidence, I mean, that's acceptable too. I mean, it
yeah.
really isn't like super problematic either way on this model. And I mean, even if you're if you're an old earther, I mean, I think you can at least agree with, I think, what I say about like the principle of apparent age. Maybe you're skeptical of applying that broadly. I'm skeptical of applying it that broadly, but that's different than
Yeah.
saying that like it's inadmissible per se, which I think a lot of old earthers do, where they're just like, well, like Adam, he he might, like, his skin might, look young because God created him young, even though his like skeleton doesn't. Like, well, like the point is that yeah, maybe it is true that like there's signs of age and signs of youngness kind of, you know
Intertwined.
intertwined in Adam. Like maybe that's true, but like the point is that if you saw his skeleton, presumably you would think Adam is old, right? And and the point is that it's not inherently deceptive. That's more or less what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the well this because I'm just inquiring. I just want to like pull out. I just want to like pull out of like what kind of ideas you have about this view. I'm not necessarily trying to promote any of my views on it, but just to have a discussion with you on your model. But I guess like one danger with someone who is adopting this view, what they would need to be careful about, and I know you are. I'm just saying for those who might want to adopt it, is like you were saying, don't adopt some sort of last Thursdayism, because I think you can get into some kind of like dangerous epistemology areas here, where like if he's able to create things with the appearance of age at one point, then what, like maybe everything we experience has apparent of age, the appearance of age. Like, how do I know that everything I'm looking back to is not just apparently, aged, right? So like you can have some sort of like epistemological issues there, I suppose.
Yeah,
Um, so you just got to be kind of careful about how you're trying to apply it, I guess. You just got to be a little bit nuanced and reserved.
yeah,
Don't go.
and that's typically, one of the big defeaters that's thrown at it, is that it undercuts, certain beliefs that you have. And I would say
Yeah,
that, I mean, it is a big objection. I would just say, I mean, it is objectively possible that that's a thing. And since God does it in some cases, it's not like, ontologically impossible. But I would say that, when God does something like that, he's abundantly clear about what he's doing. So
Yeah, you just
presumably,
have to take it on faith. I would assume, right? Like
right.
it's sort of like a good faith principle that, well, we're just gonna, like, we believe that the Earth, like the days are like literal six consecutive like 24-hour periods, and so we're sort of forced to some extent into understanding like some sort of apparent age, and so therefore we at least grant in this context that God created the world in this way, but we're going to take it on a leap of faith that he doesn't do it uh, repeatedly elsewhere, right? Would that be right?
Yeah, yeah, no, I think it's basically it. Like he doesn't do it repeatedly elsewhere, and the reason that we take it in this case independently, that we disagree with the authority of our senses in this case, is because we have direct testimony from God that isn't, that this is out of the ordinary, right? And presumably God told something to Adam about that, right? That you were created at this point, and that, yeah, while this might like mimic and look as though it like came about a long period of time and mimic some of the processes that came thereafter, like it wasn't actually created, uh, you know, over billions of years, but over, in Adam's case, was created 5 days before he came into being. So, or something along those lines. And so yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. I mean, you're justified in assuming that last Thursdayism is false, you know, except in cases where God specifically tells you that the ontology doesn't follow our ordinary understandings of how processes occur.
I got you. So just one last inquiry on my part before you continue. Um, so would you say that on your model, like, because I remember, and this will probably get posted later, but you and Noah's talk, you would talk about how like perhaps like scientific evidence can move you to sort of reconsider certain things about the biblical data differently. Would you say that your view of apparent age is something to the effect of like coming up with different solutions in light of scientific evidence, or do you think that the apparent age is something inherent in the Genesis account itself?
I'd say it's both, right? I mean, there's clearly some things in the Genesis account that involve apparent age, right? I mean, if you think that like plants were created, through a process, right? Let the earth bring forth, and that this process occurred rather quickly, right? Then you're going to think that, well, like, I mean, if you're just going on the authority of our senses and how we know that plants grow, right? There's something different going on there, right? And similarly, I mean, just what we know about how stars form, right? You wouldn't be under the impression, I mean, if the account is describing 6 24-hour days, that like stars form instantaneously. And so, like, I would say the bigger difficulty is, well, do we have like non-functional appearances of age in the creation account? Like God creating like a fossil record? No, but I also think, I mean, it's just non-functional appearance of age is just it's embedded within every single functional appearance of age. Like if God creates a mountain at a certain height, I mean that has a function, but presumably it being at this height rather than another, well, there's a reason for that, and that tends to assume a process, right? And similarly, something like an igneous rock, right? Like a rock that comes about through like magma. Like, well, I mean, it being an igneous rock has a purpose, but like it, being formed, having this implied context for it being formed, is that really purposeful? Not really, right? It's just cool, and God presumably has good reasons for doing it. And I think that's sufficient, like for saying that, well, like if the scriptures are super clear that young Earth creationism is true, then we have a model for understanding that. But as you said, right, this is concordist in the sense that you are like saying, well, how does the scientific data interact with the scriptures, right?
Yeah.
And, one way to do that is to say, well, let's relook at the scriptures and perhaps we reevaluate it and say that, well, like on second look, it's not teaching a young earth. And that's fine. Yeah. I mean, if that's your viewpoint, then presumably, yeah, I mean, there's no need to appeal to this. Now, it could
Right.
also be that, you look at the scriptures and you don't buy what I'm saying, and you're just kind of like, well, the science doesn't teach it either, so I'm kind of just holding them in uh, not conflict, but they are, antagonistic in a real sense, right? But you're still holding them because sometimes that's a rational thing to do, right? When two
Yep.
things conflict, it sometimes is rational to hold to both, even though you can't solve the paradox. And
Right.
so,
But maybe that's another video idea. Is we can do a video on the the logical coherence of allowing paradoxes in your worldviews.
yeah, no,
Because I definitely would defend that, and I think you would too. So that maybe might be a fun topic if the audience wants to hear, our defenses of paradoxes, because lots of people in the world don't like them, but I think they're quite defensible. But
yeah, I agree. I agree. So yeah, I'll turn to the global flood now, and I think that this topic should be interesting to both the young and the old earther here. I mean, provided you think the flood was global, and I think there's good exegetical reasons for that. And a lot of old earthers are global flood proponents, so it's not really a super problematic thing. So yeah, in this section, I will defend an approach to a global great deluge that doesn't rely on the controversial tenets of flood geology. Flood geology states that Noah's flood, interpreted as a globally expansive event, had a broad and discernible impact on the geological column, explaining much or all of the relevant strata that have dead carcasses and animals in them. Creationists differ on the details. The so-called new creationists differ from the Morris Whitcomb tradition, who wrote the Genesis flood. But they all agree the flood is empirically relevant to the world as we know it. Since I have always defended a view of creation that hinges upon thoroughly coherent maturity, since I have already defended a view of creation that hinges upon thoroughly coherent maturity in the created order, I have no need to assert that dinosaurs were on the ark. That same sentiment applies to other biological entities presumed to be long extinct. While I do think the problem of post-flood speciation is a difficult one, there are a number of non-scientific accounts available to the Christian. That is to say, these accounts do not rely on uniform natural mechanisms or causality. I will discuss two such accounts below. Take a water here. While most global flood proponents argue the account presupposes a natural explanation or mechanism for the source of the floodwaters, I do not believe the account provides any deductive data to that effect. The account says the waters came from the fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven. Obviously, the language here is phenomenological, but Christians should still try and preserve the import of figurative language whenever possible. Basically, at a minimum, the account presupposes that God flooded the earth through the sky and the waters below it. But beyond that, the text is indifferent towards whether God created and dried the flood according to ordinary or extraordinary providence. Ordinary providence would be God bringing about things through natural processes that he's established, and extraordinary providence would be things like miracles or bringing in to being something extraordinarily, by divine fiat, as it were. Since the design of the text is decreational, the design of Genesis 6 through 9, God is wiping out humanity and those creatures God designed to associate with him. I suggest the theological considerations of the narrative strongly lean towards extraordinary providence. Yeah, I'm kind of slurring words here, so I'm going to slow down. That is, God floods the earth and dries the earth according to supernatural causality. Not much is evident in that the creative wind of Genesis 8:1 closely mimics the Holy Spirit of Genesis 1:2, who no doubt or exercised extraordinary providence a number of times in the Genesis narrative. It is no typical wind that is drawing the waters, but God's wind, aka his spirit, the third person of the Blessed Trinity. This will factor heavily into my account of the flood. God had a decreative strategy in mind with the global flood, and that included wiping out the remnants of Noah's world and perhaps the carcasses of the animals associated with them. So perhaps it is not so evident that the archaeologist would find significant remains from the flood. God simply wanted to wipe out the world that Noah inhabited because it fell into wickedness, and in some sense, the animals were intertwined with this. So while Noah's civilization may have been developed, we may not find suggestions of that in the record. Since I think it is plausible the sons of God in Genesis 6 are fallen angelic entities, perhaps the artifacts they brought to man were perverse and dangerous. This is something to consider here, and I think it is perhaps a good explanation of why you see such developed, metalworking and other things in the Genesis account, right? This isn't simply humans left on their own, but there's actually a whole civilization that got drastically changed after between Genesis 3 and Genesis 6, and presumably this extends in some form to the Tower of Babel incident. So perhaps the artifacts they brought to man were perverse and dangerous. I agree with Michael Heiser that this is in large part why God flooded the earth to solve the Nephilim problem. Moreover, since God's decreative plans didn't extend to the fish, there is no need to explain the continued existence of freshwater and saltwater fishes in terms of natural adaptations. This is a problem that global flood proponents have, is that, well, how can like freshwater fish, survive, and, with all the water basically overflowing onto the land and shifting things, God may have miraculously preserved them, just as he preserved the light properties of the fire in Daniel's furnace. The fire's light would typically be associated with its heat and motion, but God wanted the miracle to be obvious. Indeed, he didn't design the miracle to extinguish every feature of his very good creation. Man's controlled use of fire is one of his chief merits. Similarly, God didn't design the flood to wipe out the geological features of creation. For instance, God wanted the boundaries of Eden, which approximate those of the Promised Land, to be preserved, and that includes not wiping out the rivers. A lot of really, catastrophic flood proponents think that the flood destroyed the entire, climate and the geography of the earth. I think that's false, and I think that God had very good reasons for preserving more or less the world that Noah was aware of before the flood. Recall Genesis 15 assumes the continued existence of the rivers in Genesis 2, for instance, the Tigris and Euphrates. Perhaps that also means preserving the face and grandeur of the original creation. Any globally expansive miracle will involve God acting outside the bounds of ordinary providence to preserve the rest of the goings on of the world at large. As such, since the text was utterly decreational with regards to man and the soulish animals, perhaps extending to artifacts and bones, and indifferent towards everything else, I suggest God may have provided no evidence for the flood, or at the very least, not much evidence. Indeed, many young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists who think the flood was global have suggested the age of the Earth and the way the flood is described wouldn't have produced a significant geological impact. So, for instance, I'm pretty sure one of the reasons Gauss, the defender of the Omphalos hypothesis, was defending his theory is because he was convinced that the catastrophic flood models of the scriptural geologists just weren't apt at explaining the data. So he didn't, to my knowledge, give up on the global flood, but he adopted this sort of placid global flood model that people like Buckland and others were defending at that time. So as such, since the text was utterly decreational with regards to man and the soulish animals, perhaps extending to artifacts and bones, and indifferent towards everything else. I suggest God may have provided no evidence for them. I already read that. Uh, so, as an analogy, let's assume the correct explanation of Joshua's sun miracle in Joshua 10 is that God altered the regular rotation of the earth. Now, of course, that's an exegetically dubious suggestion. I myself am comfortable saying the language here is actually metaphorical. That is to say, it describes something like, God, basically telling the sun and the earth to quit, like the sun and the moon to quit, like, acting on the earth in the way that they typically do. But God does call for the sun to stand still in the sky, and not just its rays. As a good Lutheran, I believe the literal sense should be preserved whenever possible. The sun is told to stand still in the sky, so this, to my knowledge, doesn't imply geocentrism. It just implies that, again, in the sky, that which we see above us, it is standing still. So, of course, a phenomenological explanation is acceptable, and I have already appealed to one earlier in the essay with regards to the windows of the heavens and the fountains of the deep. But I am at least somewhat pleased saying God could have preserved the structure of the earth and its rotation, indeed the existence of man and animals who were independent of the miracle, by a grand cosmic act of providence. Ordinarily, if you stop the earth from rotating, this would wreak all havoc on things, right? I mean, it would presumably wipe out everything. But God has ways of preserving this, I presume, and he might exercise really grand cosmic scale miracles for the sake of man, who is, the grand, crown of Earth, certainly, and perhaps in a sense, as the microcosm of all creation, the created order. And so he would lift the physical order for the sake of the moral order in this case. So that said, the miracle was singular in its goal. It was to be a sign for Joshua's army and the enemy Amorites. So God preserved the rest of the created order who were outside the context of the miracle. Similarly, perhaps God used floodwaters in a designed way to only punish man and the soulish animals by conduit or attachment to man. Now that invites the question, why would God use floodwaters at all if he is going to manipulate the scale of its natural causality, if he's not going to use it to, I don't know, wipe out the fish or wipe out, the mountains? Well, there are a number of reasons why God might just do that. Firstly, waters covered the world in the beginning, as Genesis 1 asserts. So it makes sense for God to return creation to that state. Truly, Peter says God created the world through water and the word. So there is something impressive going on here, at least, with regards to the imagery used. And perhaps that's why God made use of this miracle. And presumably he could have done something else, but, it makes sense why he would do this thing. Secondly, Noah's flood prefigures baptism, which God uses to save us from sin, death, and the devil / the fallen entities associated with him. All of these things were involved in the flood on my account, since I think the Nephilim were, the offspring of fallen beings. These are a type for the true salvific antitype of holy baptism. So I think God has very specific historical purposes in using a global flood here. So I will skip providing an account of Noah's Ark. That gets us into a discussion about what exactly a natural kind means, and that's really hard. The intersection of that with the various created species concept, I mean, that's really difficult. I will just assume that God moved enough created entities on the ark to create the genetic diversity we see today. I am not even convinced that he needs to do that. I think that this is a floating Garden of Eden, and God may have just created, I certainly think he created the plants that would have been killed after the fall, afterwards. And I see no reason just from the text why he couldn't have supernaturally created, say, the entities who would be wiped out in, say, North America, even though it seems like no humans were there. Like, why? God, nothing in the account assumes that God couldn't have done something like that. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that God did create enough entities on the ark to create the genetic diversity we see today. Since I do not believe Adam ever saw a dinosaur or the vast majority of entities evidenced on the fossil record, as I wrote in my first essay, I think these only have an ideal existence if my account in that essay is right. That minimizes the amount of species significantly. My account is again an account of extraordinary providence. When God fiat commands the animals to be fruitful and multiply in Genesis 8 through 9, that is a fiat of extraordinary providence, just as it was in Genesis 1. With regards to humans equipped with free choice, that command finds no automatic fulfillment. But concerning animals, the case is far different. Just as God can grow the grass and the fruit trees on the earth in a day, he can also speed up the processes of hyperspeciation by his fiat. So if God wants the earth to be populated, he can do something like that by almost, in a sense, miraculously, posing new data, new, urges on the animals. That may involve creating other animals not mentioned in the account, and I actually presume it does, but it may not. Just because God wants Adam to preserve two pairs of each kind doesn't necessarily mean these pairs will do all the work of repopulation. There might be a symbolic element to including them on the ark. That is, Noah is doing right by the original intention of God's mandate for humanity and the animals and caring for them, as opposed to the manner in which the pre-diluvian man may have treated them. But even if God doesn't create other animals after the fall, the text makes no mention of this. I actually don't mind conceptualizing this in terms of hyperevolution, albeit guided by God. My gripes are not with any specific concept or account of evolution per se. As a matter of fact, my gripes are not necessarily gripes with the notion of common descent as such as an explanatory adequate way of explaining the data. In fact, God may have created man in media res in such a way that a creature with a similar body plan to him might have come about through evolutionary processes. Of course, he wouldn't have a soul or the rational activities that come alongside that, but he might look like him and perhaps have the animal features that mimic him. But God has the prerogative to skip through the evolutionary record to get to the good part, which he chose to do so over the course of 6 days to mimic our created work week. Whether this defines migration patterns post-flood is a different story. Maybe it doesn't. But since I have two accounts to explain how post-flood speciation might work, I'm not necessarily concerned here. I will say pretty implausible notions of how animal migration work are involved in both the evolutionary account and this account. Because there's like the rafting hypothesis, with certain animals, living in continents other than what you would expect them to work on. I mean, that is a problem, I think, for most views. So as others have pointed out, this account is not verifiable. But since my project is not one of empirical proof, but one of synthesis on the basis of the Bible being a metaphysically certain principle or fount of knowledge, that does not concern me much. Secondly, as Poythress points out, Vern Poythress, in Genesis 8:22, the account assumes environmental regularity is principally the norm post-flood. Perhaps Psalm 104 teaches that this regularity extends to the world before the flood, but scientific data, at least during the flood, is not necessarily a perfect guide to the evidence, since science studies the regular behaviors of material substances. But Genesis 8:22 seems to imply the flood was a temporary exemption from God's ordinary plan of regularity through the natural powers of created secondary substances. 2 Peter 3:7 teaches that this regularity will only cease through an event that mimics the causality of the flood, the dissolution of the world through fire in the last days. And I wrote some other stuff. I didn't include that in this version, so I will end with that.
Very nice.
Yeah, I mean, what prompted me to write that part of it is because I've never been convinced of the evidence for a supposed global flood. And I do think that there are problems with it. I think that there are, evidences that people point to, like, fish bones and aquatic animal bones being in mountains. Like there might be something to that. And even in my model, there might be something to that. But even if there weren't, I really don't think it would be too problematic because there's a few things. A, God isn't trying to wipe out the geological structure of his world. B, he presumably very well could have created plants almost instantaneously to recreate the world that he destroyed in the flood so that Noah and the animals could, be fruitful and multiply. That makes sense why he would do that sort of thing. And C, I don't think there's anything super problematic in saying that God actually recreated the animals and that these were the animals that were with Noah were, just around to, allow him to make a sort of floating Garden of Eden, right? And
Yeah, I think it's
so,
like I think you can honestly kind of point to the ark as just sort of a symbol of the new creation entering a new world, right? Kind
right,
of like symbolic. It's sort of like an eschatological picture almost, I think, to some extent. Like God showing that He's going to be creating a new world and showing how He is preserving or bringing part of His creation into the new creation, so to speak. There's this kind of eschatological picture there to an extent.
yeah.
Um, like you said, this like like Noah's Ark's kind of the Eden, and going to like sort of re-enter the world or something like that. Um, that's what I think. I think it's mainly just to show like maybe stewardship, like man's role of stewardship over the animals. Like
Are you still around, Tony?
yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Uh, perhaps God's just trying to show like mankind should care about the preservation of certain species because He created different species for a reason, and so perhaps man should care to an extent about that. Who knows? There could be all sorts of reasons, but
Yeah, and I think that, it also makes sense that if he wants Noah to be fruitful and multiply, that he would give them a certain amount of animals to work with, right?
yeah,
I don't think, again, that means that dinosaurs were on the ark or any other entities that weren't necessary to that goal, but it would be true that, yeah, I mean, very plausible that, uh, this is a much smaller amount than is typically construed, right? I mean, what is a created kind? That is a very hard thing to determine just on the basis of the scriptural evidence. Is it just here are the creatures that you need for like milking? Here are the creatures that you need for uh, you know uh, refining grain, like any number of things, right? Like
yeah,
it's it's unclear like what that means in the context of Genesis, and people have debated that, and that's why you see these really grandiose number about the amount of kinds that would be included on the ark, and then you see much smaller numbers. Like it's just not clear scripturally what that means, and so could be a very very small number, could be slightly larger. I'm not especially interested in that. I mean, I assume God found something to make this work. Uh,
yeah. It's almost kind of pointless to even like delve into that because we can't really know the ancient author's perspective on that and what they were thinking when they wrote that, and because like how we probably conceptualize in modern times of like how we diversify between kinds is just so much different maybe than how they did.
yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't follow the modern biological species categorization.
Oh yeah, no, it's a lot different.
I mean, if it does, right, then I mean, I mean, it would be impossible for all those creatures to fit on the ark if you think that every single species was. But if you think it's just like, yeah, here's like, horses, right? There's like two.
Maybe all the children's books were right then. They only put like zebras and lions. You
Yeah,
know,
something like very, very small amount. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, one of those things that's worth pondering. But yeah, I mean, I do think like you know people who say with certainty either way, I think they're just wrong. Yeah,
yeah, I think I can't remember for sure if you mentioned this in your article, maybe another line of extra biblical evidence some people could point to. It's not the most compelling, obviously, but it is like if you're trying to build a cumulative case for a global flood, you could point to the fact that like in ancient Near Eastern context with like other pagan religions around that time, they have myths uh, of global floods in a lot
Right.
of their beliefs. Um, so that's interesting. I'm not. It's not does obviously the strongest evidence in the world, but it is at least there's at there's at least some sort of consistent picture of the formation of the world in a lot of these ancient Near Eastern religions, and I think that's something at least to consider a little bit.
Yeah.
That they all, well, not necessarily every ancient Near Eastern religion, obviously, but a lot of them will mention some kind of like global purging or global flood like event um, that kind of swept through the earth, so to speak. So I think that's interesting. Not heard of that before. Something I think that if you're committed to a global flood, I don't think that's like terrible uh, evidence to point to. If you're looking for extra biblical evidence, anyway.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, the local flood proponent, at least the one who is trying to explain this data, I mean, they're at least going to have to claim that like humans were like very, close together at a certain point that the flood occurred, and that seems to be inconsistent with some things that we see, in the evidence. So both sides are going to have their issues, even if they're trying to explain that. But yeah, I do agree. I mean, the global flood proponent, the only way to explain the global flood, to explain the evidence that you mentioned, is to adopt a model that also has evidential issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, that is, like, I would say, a pretty good argument in favor of a global flood. But yeah, I'm actually gonna go to the restroom really quick, and then I'm gonna finish this last section. Shouldn't be too long.
Okay.
Go talk to the people, Tony. And
Uh,
by people, I mean the one person watching right now.
uh, okay. Hope everyone's doing all right. Yeah. Uh, let's see here. Yeah, like Cameron mentioned, there is some evidence in a fossil record here and there of like some fish bones being on some like pretty high points, like on some mountain regions and stuff. So if you're looking for extra biblical evidence for a global flood, you can point to the ancient Near Eastern religions and the fossil record of times. But yeah, there's a little bit of you know faith involved. I think no matter what view you take, the global flood view is definitely a more straightforward reading of the text, but there's a lot of caveats you got to make it work. So yeah, that's all I got to really say about that. Wait for Cameron to come back.
I don't know if there is going to be a fun part, John, but yeah, no, I agree with that. I heard what you said there. Yeah, I mean, so basically, right? There's like good traditional evidence for it. And like the argument against the global flood biblically is that it just requires a lot of miracles that the account doesn't mention, right?
Sure.
And that is like I think something, but the argument is whether is whether there's extra biblical or biblical reason to think those miracles are plausible. And I do think those miracles are plausible. I think that like God has a specific strategy with the flood, and as such, we can expect him to do certain things. Now, again, at a certain point, we have to just say, well, like our reason really can't like totally understand that, and God can like just make good on this miracle in ways that we can't understand. But at the end of the day, I mean, it still is interesting to ponder like what sorts of things God might do. Uh, ultimately, at the end of the day, I mean, as with any of God's miracles, he alone is the one who knows how to make good on it. So we'll just
Yeah,
leave it.
I think that talking point on their part's kind of. Mm, I think it's not the most proper thing to say, especially when you're dealing with the book of Genesis specifically, because the book of Genesis is not too concerned in a lot of the book on explaining in extremely excruciating detail, point by point, every single bit of thing that occurred in certain events. It's very kind of like touch and go, in my opinion. It explains a, uh, a an event in broad, encompassing language rather than like super detailed, specific language. Like when you get to the book, the rest of the Pentateuch, like in Exodus through Deuteronomy, it's so much more attention to detail than Genesis is. You know, so I think it's a. I don't think it's the most charitable or impressive uh, um, refutation on their part. I would say.
Yeah, yeah,
Just
it's not hyper charitable and hyper.
yeah, exactly. It's not very Lofton like, you know.
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, and as Lutherans, I mean, we've long thought that just things that the Scripture say can posit miracles. I mean, they can require miracles. So, perhaps like, yeah, the words of institution don't specifically say I'm going to miraculously join my body and blood to the elements, but that's just implied by the words being there, right?
Yeah,
And similarly, I mean, maybe it isn't implied. Maybe the text doesn't outright say, you know, I am going to repopulate the earth like extraordinarily, or I am going to preserve, saltwater fishes. But like it just is a requirement, just given the sort of strategy God has in mind and what he says in the account that he is going to do. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much all I'll say in this section. I'll read section 3 to close it out. Theses on the doctrine of apparent age. So I won't read each individual theses like thesis 1, thesis 2. I'll just read it line by line. So provided God chose to create a causally coherent universe, one absent a cosmic singularity, there will always be at least some inferable past history. That is to say, there are good reasons to think God might have created a young universe with an implied but prochronic ancient past that is a purely conceptual or ideal past history. Peter G. Nelson provides the following formula as a demonstration. Then its state, as represented by the positions of its elementary components, can be expressed as a continuous function of time, ft, where t equals 0, is the time of creation. Now, since f is a continuous function, states that can be calculated from f for t is less than 0. Thus, when at t equals 0, the system is created, it inevitably appears to have had a previous history. Not even God can create it without it having this appearance. The only exception is if f was a singularity at t equals 0, if it's a sort of Big Bang type situation. Now, as an illustration, if God chooses to will a causally coherent fruit tree, that fruit tree will involve at least one inferable past history. It grew to such and such a height, had a particular portion of dead bark on its exterior, had a certain amount of fruits, was no longer in seed form, etc. These imply both small scale and large scale processes. Even if God willed a singular particle in motion, one going down an infinite straight path, we could always infer from its current behavior where it would be positioned in the past if it were willed diachronically, that is, in real time. That is to say, if you imagine this particle just, going down an infinite straight line and God creates it at this place and it's still moving, you would infer it was at this place, right? Even if when God created in motion, it was, beyond that point. You still could conceptualize where it would be at times previous to that. And that conceptual existence does have a context in God's mind that explains why it was willed at the point in which it was willed. So, similarly, even if Adam had no belly button, as Goss thought, he would have a certain height, have a certain weight, bone density, one consistent with a mature adult male. God's causal strategy for willing Adam into the world was to have Adam interact with a causally coherent creation, perhaps even bringing order to it. That much is true whether the apparent age doctrine is correct. That is to say, Adam was interacting with something that was mature, or at least looked mature. If you think the earth was old, he is still willing Adam into being at a point in which he is interacting with something that at least looks like it was around for a long time. So, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that which is below and that which is above, he created. But perhaps the earth, that is our locale in the cosmos, is most intelligible through an inferable past history, one almost constitutive of the earth qua earth. So, this is sort of the origins essentialism. I'm not fully committing myself to that, but the causal history of a thing is important in making that thing the sort of thing it is. So if the earth didn't go through these processes, it, in a real sense, just wouldn't be the earth. So the scars of craters, the sedimentation, the presence of buried igneous rocks from prehistoric volcanoes, etc., all are part of what it means to be the earth in the context of our universe. Just as my physical history is part and parcel of who I am, perhaps the Earth's past history is modally vital to what it is. As such, perhaps the fossils of creatures, whether living or non-living, are essential to shaping the Earth into the coherent whole it now is. Dinosaurs, treated as prochronically present, albeit non-existent creatures, may have shaped the Earth's foliage, which had an effect on the soil layers, which had an effect on the structure of the Earth. As to say, the implied existence of dinosaurs is still causally important to the Earth today. That even applies to the smallest or littlest of animals. A small rodent who died 100,000 years ago in the prochronic past still has some implied causal contribution to the Earth, similar to that of a small planet at the edge of the universe. It's a very small causal contribution, but it is technically still there. But no one doubts God has good reasons for willing the latter. He wills Pluto, which has very little of an impact on us, but it still is part of God's very good creation. So why couldn't he will the former? Therefore, God is not putting fossils or non-functional elements into the record to confuse the scientist. No, instead, the scientist is thinking God's thoughts after him, including the elements of logical and implied chronological priority in God's plan for the causally coherent earth. There is nothing grander than to encounter the mental life of the divine. So that is part of this view, is that the scientist should try to instrumentally act as though the earth is pretty old. It makes good predictions. It seems to work, And so, if that helps him do good predictive science, he should do so. And there is something deeply divine about that. You are thinking God's thoughts after him. But that doesn't mean you're thinking it in the same way that God thinks it. God thinks it in a purely conceptual way, at least for some of the time. He thinks it as in a causal way in terms of the things he brings about. So Humans are still should be interested in the implied past, but that doesn't mean that they're committing themselves to the actual diachronic or real existence of that past. God could have done this immediately, but he prefers to use secondary causes, whether real or implied. As such, the conceptual universe in God's intellect, the universe implying a past history and a logical ordering of priority and posteriority, is ultimately involved in the creation process. God brings a conceptual universe into being, and the implied past of that abstract universe does logically exist, at least in the mind of God. No detail of the universe is so unimportant to God that he does not directly will it. God numbers the hairs on our heads, after all. All parts of creation are functional. Not all parts of creation are functional in the same way. A flying bird is fulfilling its telos. It is a well-functioning animal. It's fulfilling its intrinsic end. A fossilized bird is not fulfilling its per se end, but it may be fulfilling its accidental or extrinsic end, its extrinsic telos. That is, in shaping the universe towards God's glory. It also has a minor, albeit very much present causal function in shaping the Earth's layering or its strata. As such, while a living bird is fulfilling its telos of present function, a prochronically deceased bird is fulfilling its telos of causal coherence. But both are functioning very good, as the Genesis account says. God could have willed all parts of the creation together all at once. He could have willed the universe a relatively short period of time ago with some apparent cosmic history all in 1 second, even less than that. Nonetheless, God chose to act as a cosmic workman, taking 6 natural days to bring creation into being. This provides the pattern and foundation for our work week. God did this with foresight. He knew humans would fall and have a proclivity to worship the elements of the world. So, to make an important theological point, God spent days working on the different elements of creation. Humans are inclined to worship the sun, therefore, God gives them a day for creation, day 4. Same for animals, they get a day, 2 days actually. As such, when God wills the light without a light bearer and wills the earth and its plant life without the secondary causes that sustain them, God is making 2 points. Firstly, God, not secondary causes, are the true source of our sustenance. Secondly, God is patterning a cosmic temple out of the earth, created first, and humans are at the center of it all. That involves creating a certain logical ordering, and the creation days indicate that. He makes the created realms. It makes sense, for instance, that he would create, the earth, the light, and the land, and then he would and the firmament, and then he would will the things that occupy that later. So this is, in a sense, sort of a framework view, but it would be a framework view that actually takes the days to be pretty literal, and would just take seriously some of the insights of that account without adopting it. All the same, the creation is not complete until God fills in all the gaps. As such, God offers the causal contribution of the implied but not yet causally present element directly. God sustains the light as though the sun were doing it, moves the tides in such a way that the moon's presence is implied, and sustains gravitation as though the sun were in the picture. In my model, the presence of a fossil record is not problematic. It is no more disturbing than the existence of igneous rocks from volcanoes that never erupted in the diachronic time scheme. These animals would have a conceptual life and death. While they do not have a real life and death, their abstract life and death have some impact on the earth as it is. I myself follow those fathers who felt animal death and predation were part and parcel of God's very good creation. So fossils would not be problematic. But even if you think, if you follow those fathers who did think that animal death was bad, I think what you could say is, and this is a viewpoint that Eric Phillips and others take, is that perhaps they're only bad in relation to Adam's headship, and so since the fossil record would only indicate animal death that occurs without the implied existence of Adam's headship, this wouldn't be problematic. And since animals still might have a natural antipathy towards each other, they might kill each other, and they might be the sorts of things that are prone to that. Adam's existence is just a sort of temporary, or if he succeeded in the covenant, a eternal ceasefire from that natural state, a sort of almost a deification, as it were, above, the state of nature. But I quite like William Dembski's theodicy for animal death. Just as the imputation of Adam's sin has future tense implications and the imputation of Christ's righteousness past tense ones, perhaps God willed the created order with the foresight of Adam's sin. That means creating a climate of corruption outside the garden with the foresight that Adam would fall. That does not mean setting him up for failure. None of the causes present in the garden necessitated his fall. That is to say, the earth, would evidence corruption outside the garden. But it is still true that, if Adam did persist in goodness, then, that never would have happened. And so this is almost a middle knowledge account of things and how the fall works. So that means creating a climate of corruption outside the garden with the foresight that Adam would fall. That does not involve setting, I already read that. A world of death and implied past history of death might impress upon Adam the threats of the law and the unfortunate bedfellow that is his eventual demise outside the garden. The best objection to this view, in my opinion, obviously, not matter of fact, if causal coherence is true, then would Adam have past memories? If the universe is totally causally coherent, would Adam have past memories? But I think this misunderstands the point of God's creative strategy. God may have made Adam at the point he would have created him if God chose to use diachronic history, but it's still creation. He isn't, as it were, coming about, just with this implied evolutionary past. Now, the evolutionary past, or the progressive creationist past, is the context for which God created him in the specific diachronic point that he did. But that's different than saying that God created Adam using evolution. Adam was created from the dust of the ground, after all. So I think the implied past teaches something like progressive creationism, but perhaps God wills Adam in the exact moment similar hominids would come about through evolution. I do not believe God gave these hominid souls or even rational behaviors for that matter, so they have no bearing on the transfer of original sin. We tend to be pretty strong traducianists about that. But they do provide the conceptual context for Adam's creation, and Adam's progeny may have interbred with them, these hominids, just as they may have interbred with angels on certain readings of Genesis 6. Perhaps these beings were actually the sort of physical conduit, as it were, for that occurring. I mean, it's worth pondering if you do take that reading of Genesis 6, which I do. Moreover, God may also have had another creative strategy in mind. While I think there is no good argument for thinking an implied physical past is deceptive, I mean, it just occurs in the scriptures, there is a good argument for thinking an implied mental history is. It would undercut Adam's future memories. Thus, perhaps Adam is the exception here, because Adam's mental life was essential to God willing Adam in media res, in the middle of things, in the middle of the story that is creation. God was introducing a new being into the equation, one whose mental life and creativity he valued much like his own. God's creative strategy wasn't complete causal coherence as such, but complete causal coherence for the recently created Adam to interact with. Adam himself is only as causally coherent as he needs to be to fulfill that task. That is, his body plan has the implied structure of a 30 or so year old man. Indeed, perhaps God gives Adam a 30-year-old's mental life, albeit without the memories of one. That is to say, God wills Adam as a causally coherent 30-year-old without memories of an implied childhood or childbirth. And that is the type of thing Adam and in turn Eve are. So, getting towards the end here, this account has explanatory scope only for non-human appearance of age. Adam is fit to be our federal head precisely because he is the first human, and conceptual humans prior to Adam are theologically problematic. It is theologically problematic to say that there are other conceptual humans prior to Adam. Well, are they represented by him or not? That's really unclear. As such, I argue the earth is older than a straightforward reading of the Genesis genealogies would suggest. In doing so, I follow Byron C. Nelson and other Lutherans who accept gaps in the Genesis genealogies. Concordia Chicago's Andrew Steinman has recently defended this position as well. Steinman himself posits these gaps after doing a genre analysis of the genealogies in the scriptures, as well as a grammatical analysis of the verbs in the Genesis account. He is motivated not so much by a harmonization of the Genesis genealogies with modern science, but rather a harmonization or a supposed or attempted harmonization of the chronology with the Egyptian one. As such, I argue the term beget in the Genesis genealogies only means to establish a lineage or cause to bear. I mean, there's pretty frequent occurrences of this in the scriptures where the term beget is used and it doesn't describe strict relations to that effect. I think the only consistent way to read that would apply to both father-son relations and grandfather, grandson and great grandfather grandson relations, which are sometimes used in the scriptures with the term beget, is to say that it just means, at a minimum, it just consistently means to establish a lineage. The account does not say the age of the progenitors at the birth of their progeny. It just says that person A was 900 or so when they established the lineage that led to person B, say Enoch. Conceivably, the progenitor could be long dead at the birth of his progeny, but the account says at the minimum that this is when the progenitor caused the lineage or the line of descent that led to the birth of the progeny, as I said. So the accounts connects Adam to Noah and Noah to Abraham. Genesis also describes the theologically significant persons in between, Enoch, Seth, people to that effect. So the ages are listed, not to say the age of the patriarchs at the time of the birth of their progeny. In some cases, that is the case. Adam was this age when he had Seth, but it isn't clear that, once you get past these early genealogies where I think it's very important to establish father and son relations, that it's this strict. There's things in the account that break, strict, I would say, face value reading. So for instance, when Noah has his 3 kids, in the account it says he's such and such an age when he begets, his 3 sons. Well, were they triplets? No, it just means that, he was this age when he established the lineage that led to the 3 of them, in a sense. So the account isn't especially interested in wooden literalism here. I think it's just basically connecting person A to theologically significant person B, and that's ultimately what it's interested in. And there's a strong messianic component here, and it describes when they appropriated the promise of the coming Messiah, the promised seed of Genesis 3. So in this account, it's saying, well, person A, Adam, was 900 when he appropriated the promise, when he said, I am going to be part of the lineage through which the promised seed comes from. And it's true that, people are almost expecting the promised seed to come within the generation. It seems like, when in Genesis 4, when Eve says, I have gotten a son by the Lord, many translations have that, I have gotten a son the Lord, to the effect that she thought she was the one who was, in a sense, immediately bringing about that promised seed right then and there. But rather, it's the case that each generation is appropriating that promise, and in a sense, they are involved in bringing that about, even though it doesn't happen immediately. They are still, part and parcel of the process through which redemption comes to the world, and that's what Genesis is interested in. So the ages decline as the earth falls into greater and greater sin. You don't have 900-year-old people by the time you get to David, for instance. But God's providence in bringing the Messiah forth is greater than the sin of the progenitors and patriarchs. So yeah, with that said, that is pretty much it. Yeah. So yeah. Any comments? See, there's 2 people watching currently, so it should be interesting. By the way, Tony, are you still on?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I'm still here.
Yeah. That's pretty much it. Yeah. So, my own take on the Genesis genealogies is that they follow the general structure of most genealogies in Scripture, which is to say that they're interested in making, broad stroke, sort of observations about, chronology that they're establishing, but they're not interested in the specifics so much, right? And you know, the reason why you would be skeptical of trying to say that this could calculate an age of the Earth isn't strictly because you think the science is like suggestive of a really old Earth. It could be that you just think that the Egyptian chronology implies something older than the Genesis account. I mean, that's Steinman's motivation here, right? And so like again, on this picture, I'm still positing that the Earth was created in 6 natural days. The whole universe was created in 6 natural days. Uh, but I'm not so committed to saying that the Earth was 10,000 years old. I mean, at 6 to 10,000 years old, it could be much older. Again, how would that even look like? I mean, we really can't say. And especially if there were like frequent interventions by non-human entities that sort of sped up the processes that were going on for periods of times. For instance, like it seems like metalworking is in the equation pretty early. uh, there isn't really anything, in my opinion, that requires that this occurred recently. uh, I mean, obviously it occurred recently in one sense. I mean, in the evolutionary picture, even 100,000-year-old Earth is really young, but like, I mean, that still is very old in relation to the amount of time that we've had recorded history. So I would still be young in that sense. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. Anything you'd like to add, Tony?
Um, what was would you? I guess like one last clarification on your last part of the article. Would you say that God sort of utilizes an appearance of age with like fossil records and like plate shifts and stuff to basically be like a sort of toolkit for like utilizing like useful fictions to do science?
Yeah, well, I wasn't saying God specifically utilized that, but I said that humans can use the implied past as a useful fiction. They can almost treat it as if it were real if it makes them if they make good predictions out of it, right?
Or
And
is that like something I guess like the that because like instead of like God not creating these things to deceive, he's creating them for potentially some other purposes on the impression of like intelligent creatures who are reflecting on those things that came before them, right? Like,
yeah, I think there's a few reasons. I mean, I don't think he was when he created them, he wasn't especially interested in the processes of science that would occur later. I'm using the term processes too much in this stream. The scientific endeavors that would come later. He was making theologically important, points, and there's reasons why he might do this. I mean, it just maybe God's really efficient and he doesn't want to go through the whole history of creation, right? you know like I don't think there's anything like morally significant about animals coming into the equation, so maybe God just skips to the point where the animals were when humans were created, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But it still might be the case that like the universe he willed, in that short period of time looks like it's old, and perhaps if we make like predictions about like the Earth and say, well, we should expect to find these fossils here given how old the Earth is. I mean, if you make good predictions based on that, it's okay to treat the Earth as if it were that old, because in a real sense, it kind of is, in the sense that there is this implied past that is, billions upon billions of years old. It's even possible on this model that the universe has an implied infinite past. I mean, I don't agree with that, but let's say, for instance, like you don't think the arguments against actual infinities are any good. I'm not committed to that, Tony. Like it's not worth like debating, right? Man, that sounded
I was
like
about to
really like a
say, I was about to say,
not like
Now you're about to really get me interested in this. No, I was kidding.
Yeah, no, that sounded like really aggressive. That was like not my intent.
Let
But
me blow off the dust on my Prus and my Coons and see. I'm just kidding.
yeah, but basically, right. Like let's say, for instance, right, like you think for whatever reason, like, and I can't think of any good scientific reason to think this nowadays, but perhaps you think for whatever reason, like a self-oscillating, like sort of like eternal universe is like true, right? That the universe is like contracting, and it's doing this like eternally, and you become convinced of that, right? Well, that actually makes this model make a lot more sense, because if the physical laws of the universe require something like that, then God would just have to create things in the middle of things, right? If they are to be created in time. Uh, and so, like, this is, if a big bang or something like that is in the picture, then, it's a different scenario. But, uh, because the Big Bang has an implied past, so there would be an implied beginning point. But even if there wasn't an implied beginning point, right, it still, this model would have, actually, I think, more explanatory scope. And I think that's why Gauss actually initially posited it. He thought that time was cyclical, right? That things were just sort of like consistently in the process, animal life especially, of just like you know uh, birth and rebirth, right? So things die, and then they, through God, obviously they come into being again, and then they die, and that's just part and parcel of what it means to be living. And he thought that, like, the scientific evidence was going to vindicate him as well, that the universe operated like this. Even plants kind of like died and were reborn in a sense. Obviously, that didn't happen, but like what he was getting at was, well, I mean, if that's just what it means to be living, then if God were to create anything, he would have to create them in the middle of one of those sequences, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there isn't such a thing as a recently created object that doesn't have an implied past, that didn't actually exist, right? On his view.
Well, yeah, I wanted to. Yeah, I was thinking too. Like, you could actually believe in an infinite implied past and still believe in actual, like, non-literal infinitude of the past, because the thesis of like a non-actual infinite implies like actual causation. There's no actual causation of causes, or no actual chain of infinite causes that exists, right?
Yeah.
So, like, on this model, there is no actual infinite chain of causes on an implied past model, because the implied past is causally impotent, right? It doesn't actually cause those appearances don't cause anything in the world, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I think that, yeah, that is actually an interesting way out. Like, could this be like a non-causal infinite potentially? I mean,
Yeah,
no,
because I
I
mean,
would think it would
because
have
what?
to be causal, at least in the sense that it like is implied causal, although it's not actually
Well,
causal.
because we can use patchwork principles to conceptualize infinite regresses, even in our own minds, right? But by doing those thought experiences, we can show that uh, those concepts can't be actualized, right? That's the claim. So, like, God can even conceptualize infinite causal chains, but the thesis would say, like, he can't actualize them, basically.
Yeah, no, that's actually interesting, and yeah, that might be a way of preserving this, so that, yeah, I mean, maybe the physical evidence looks like that, but then we have like logical reasons to think that actual infinites are impossible. Like, it's worth considering. I mean, I don't think that
Yeah,
writing.
I mean, I don't think the evidence either way points to there being an infinite past,
Right.
regardless if you take your model or not. But, like, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just saying, even if you know there was evidence for an infinite past on your model, there is actually a way out. Funny enough,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. No, that's actually. Yeah. No, that's a real insight there. Actually, I'm kind of
yeah.
kind of glad you brought that up. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, yeah, as far as like the motivations for this, I mean, can I've long personally been an old earther. I've reconsidered this question recently in light of I've always felt uneasy about how the Senate has approached this question. I mean, growing up, I even accepted evolution. It really wasn't a problem. And I still think there's okay evidence for it, but I did become increasingly more convinced and more sympathetic to the young Earth creationist reading of Genesis and the flood. So I was thinking, well, like I still wasn't convinced of the arguments that people were providing. I actually am, in a sense, more convinced of intelligent design than I am convinced of any of the arguments for like a young Earth. But it's funny, actually, in my model, it makes more sense to say that almost a sort of hands-off evolution occurred until in the implied past until uh, the fourth day when God started creating creatures, or I guess sorry, the fifth day when he started creating creatures, the third day if you extend this to plant evolution. Uh, like making this hands off actually makes more sense than saying that there's like implied supernatural causal contributions that God made in the past, right? Like if it's just like a process like any other, obviously involving biological causes rather than strictly geological or astronomical causes, right? Uh, it still is the sort of thing that it makes sense why God would will that either sped up or just will it like in the middle of things just all at once. But if he has to supernaturally bring about like when horses come into the equation and when dogs come into the equation and when other things come into the equation, like it makes less sense why he would take take uh, 6 days to do this rather than taking billions of years, right? Uh, but yeah, if evolution is in the equation, it makes sense why it would speed up that process and why our current rates of change wouldn't be adequate at explaining what God actually did. So
Right.
so yeah, I mean,
Or maybe you take the hyperbolic time chamber view where God creates one day and then lets everything sit in the stop time until nature takes its course and then rewinds time,
yeah.
restarts time.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, that was a good one. The funny thing also is about this is that yeah, I mean, Adam would have to be the exception here because we do think that Adam would have to have something that would be strictly supernatural in this view, right? I mean, he would have to have a soul, right? So it makes sense why God would stop, this sped up natural process to get to the point where he wanted to create Adam. Uh, Even if he used, sped up almost evolutionary mechanisms to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That isn't like super problematic on this view. I think it actually makes sense. And uh, yeah, I'm not like adverse to saying that evolution is true. I just think that like evolution is true in the sense that it might be the model that makes the best predictions about about biological life forms. Doesn't mean it's actually true in the sense that that's what God used, but it might be that evolution just looks like how the implied past is, right? And and that's fine on my view. Actually, I think that that's perfectly yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
So yeah. Any other questions, guys? Because I won't hold anyone longer than they need to be. I see that we still have they need to be as though like this is a class. I see we still have 2 people watching. And I'm so weird. I don't know why I freaking talk the way I do sometimes.
You're good, man. This is scholastically free.
Yes, yeah, we're the scholasticist of the Lutherans. Well, this has been fun. This has been real.
Yeah.
This is. I mean, I'm glad I finally got to read those Facebook posts. They were a lot more rough than I thought they were going to be. I really don't edit those Facebook posts, except like, I run Grammarly through them sometimes, right?
Mm.
And but like they are really just kind of stream of consciousness, so they kind of reflect a lot of probably pent up ADHD and maybe some autism, in there. But uh, I think I covered a lot. I covered a lot of data. I think I can say that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
I
definitely,
mean, there's
definitely.
very few things I didn't cover. Now, how well they connected, that's a different story. But yeah, that Lord's Child, I have just arrived. No, I mean, if you want to ask a question, I mean, we can stay on longer. We're just
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, any question you got? I will say, Cameron, I think you did a really good job presenting the um, aged appearance of age model. I think you uh, demonstrated it in a very cohesive and defensible way. And I think you also present it in such a way that it allows for a wide range of views on differing topics to fit with your model as well. So I think there's like a lot going for it in terms of like appeal in that sense. Like you don't have to like give up, you don't have to like commit to a ton of different things, to hold your position.
yeah. I
Um,
mean, that's ultimately what I'm trying to get at, right? Is that I know that our Senate has a specific position. I know there's a lot of people in our Senate in natural science. I think there's a lot of people in history as well. Uh, you know,
yeah.
yeah. So are any of you young Earth? Well, uh, Tony isn't exactly young Earth, if I can reveal that. You can
Yeah, I'm
go.
not.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I'm still doing research because I mean that's just the role of theology, I guess. You're never done studying. Uh, but as of right now, I am definitely agnostic on the young Earth issue. I lean towards it. I lean towards me personally not being completely convinced of uh, some of the arguments for sure. Like I do have some pause. Like I think the best, honestly, I think the best thing going for it is the model you presented today. Like no joke. Um, the only reserves I really have are like I guess some aesthetic ones really.
No,
uh,
I mean I have those ones too. I mean, it's not like
yeah,
I mean I honestly that this model is super weird to me in a lot of ways, and you know it's sort of a fallback position in a lot of respects. I mean, I'm pretty sympathetic with a lot of old Earth readings. I mean, it's not
yeah,
like I'm. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it really just comes down to like a very few select questions, whether the account is globally expansive or not. I could, accept Selhammer's view of local creationism. I'm sympathetic enough with that. I'm also reasonably sympathetic with John Collins, analogical day view. I mean, I'm sympathetic with it. Now,
right.
do I hold it? It really is just a day by day thing here. I didn't defend a viewpoint that was either one of those, but yeah. I mean, so I would call myself. I mean, currently I am a young earther in the sense that I think currently, after just considering all the views and considering all all the ways that I approach the data, whether that be scriptural or non-scriptural, scientific and historical. I mean, I would be young earther in the sense that I think the Earth was and the universe was created in 6 natural 24-hour days, but I think the
Sure.
Earth could be theoretically, very, very old in the context of that. I mean, much older than 10,000.
Right.
I mean, I'm sympathetic with it being. I mean, if you throw a number, I mean, I would consider it probably. I mean, if you push it up to 1 million, I mean, I don't even think there's scientific evidence for humans coming onto the scene, that early. But I mean,
Right.
if you told me
Yeah.
like, go on.
Yeah. I was just saying, like, I mean, I think if I did become convinced exegetically of young Earth creationism, then I would definitely adopt your proposal. I mean, I think it's the most defensible, and I think it like it might not be the most satisfying to the skeptic, I guess. I mean, what's satisfying to a skeptic anyway, most of the time, but uh, it actually allows you to have a coherent worldview in light of the scientific data we have today.
Yeah.
It does explain all of it. Um, like it might not be like the most appetizing at first, but it does allow for a logically coherent and possible explanation of all the data that we observe through our senses, through with our scientific data currently. And I think that's what's I think appealing about your model specifically is that it actually does propose a real solution to the dilemma. Like there is an actual real solution. There is no strict contradictions, or anything like that. So I think there's a lot going for your view, which is why I've always felt like young Earth creationists should not be looked down on.
Yeah.
They're very smart and they can contribute a lot to the discussions in terms of our knowledge of the world. And I mean the idea that the past is not exactly what it appears to be isn't a completely absurd belief. It's obviously possible. Um, we just have to have certain pre-considerations to get there, right? And I think if you're a Christian, then you have good reasons to accept that idea, you know. So, or at least possible reasons to, because if you believe in an omnipotent God, then you can opt for something like that. So, yeah.
I muted myself. Yeah, and that's ultimately why I'm sympathetic with it. Is that like at the end of the day, right? I think that we can afford to be a bit heretical, I guess you can say, with regards to the evidence, right? I mean, we can we have a God who could do something like that. I mean, he does it in a few instances in the scriptures, and so like at the end of the day, I mean, perhaps it's true that there actually is like a scientifically viable like model of saying the Earth is like young, right?
Yep.
I'm saying like even the science, like without like this appearance of age stuff, implies a young Earth. I mean, maybe it does.
Sure.
I
Sure.
mean, that I like at the end of the day, that could be true. But even if it weren't, I mean, Scripture does have primacy here. There is like an interaction between the two, but at the end of the day, like, we can do science with the knowledge that perhaps, it didn't occur exactly like our best theories currently point to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then that's cool, I think. I mean, that's actually kind of
Yeah,
important.
I think the best way, in my opinion, to defend young Earth creationism against certain scientific arguments is just to point to certain limitations science has, even in its own field, like with things like general relativity, for example. Like, there's no way to prove that light moves at a constant speed from point A to point B. You just have to assume it, right?
Yeah, and,
So
then, and that does factor into a lot of things within this.
right. So like, I think that's like a good way because revelation for us, like how God reveals things to us, obviously gives us a interpretive grid of how we see the world. gives us a interpretive grid of how we come into contact with the world through our ethics, through our metaphysics, even through our natural sciences to an extent, right? Like our study of the external world is based off the belief that God created the world and that it's intelligible, right?
Right.
And so we have certain assumptions that way that the world is intelligible and it was created with ends and that allows us to do science. That because there is a ultimate creator, everything has an explanation for why something happens. Following a certain principle of sufficient reason, which allows us to do science. And if you take God out of the picture, and you have a completely, skeptical worldview, you don't really have much good reasons or much good justifications for holding to a lot of those ideas. So I think at the very least, a young earther can kind of put the skeptic on an even playing field on this issue.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and that's ultimately all I think they need to do. I think it's not necessarily something that we should, because general revelation isn't specifically pointing towards, really, really, really grandiose and detailed truths. General revelation. Does general revelation give you general relativity? I mean, yes, in the sense that general natural revelation points to natural phenomena, but it doesn't give you that equation. What it tells you is that God made it, right? That's why it's revelation. And so
exactly.
trying to go beyond that is I think, is not the most sure strategy. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I had to say. I think I'm getting pretty tired. This is my second time reading all that straight, so that kind of took some gas out of me. I read this earlier for my own channel. But yeah, I mean, last thing, replying to your comment in full, Lord's Child. I mean, we talked about, in case you want to watch this later, talked about apparent age. We talked about Noah's flood, how we can conceptualize this without committing ourselves to this strictly catastrophic theory of how it's global. And we discussed some theses on apparent age, and that got us into how the Genesis genealogies work and things like that. So yeah, I guess this would be sort of a defense of a hybrid young Earth model. So it's young Earth in the sense that it does posit 6 natural creation days and a global flood, but it doesn't posit some of the mechanisms that young Earth creationists typically use, or the time frame that young Earth creationists are typically committed to, which is 6 to 10,000 years.
Right.
But yeah, with that said, God bless all you guys who watch this. Really appreciative of that. I mean, hope it wasn't too boring, but I enjoyed it, and I'm glad you came along for the ride. Thank you as well, Tony, for a good conversation partner here. So yeah, Lord be with you. Bye.